Welcome to episode 75 of the Band Hive Podcast.
You're listening to the Band Hive Podcast, the number one online resource for DIY bands to learn about the music business and touring. If you want to turn your band into a lean, mean touring machine, you're in the right place. Now, let's get this show on the road.
It is time for another episode of the Band Hive Podcast. My name is James Cross, and I'm here with Matt Hose of Alive in Barcelona. How are you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing pretty awesome, James. It's an absolute gorgeous day, and we're about to have some gnarly Colorado mountain weather come in, but I think we're all prepared for it. So we see the light at the end of the tunnel. How's everything over there on the east side?
I'm glad to hear that, and things are good here. I've been enjoying the weather as well. Gone for a walk of about a mile, I think the past 4 days in a row, which is like a record considering that April is usually still snowy in Vermont. But I'm also doing really, really well and very excited to have a special guest, Vadim Kharaz of DIY Recording Guys, joining us today. How's it going, Vadim?
It's going really well, guys. I'm super excited to be here with you.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your Monday morning to join us.
Indeed.
It's Monday, April 12th, but we all know that this episode is coming out on May 4th. So let me just start by saying, may the 4th be with you.
I love it. We'll have to adjust some of my allegories to be space-themed or something. I'll have to try to do that on the fly here.
How did you record the sounds on the Death Star, Vadim? That's what I want to know.
That's a great question. What you do, it takes a lot of aluminum foil and springs, some old mattresses. I don't know.
When you said aluminum foil, I was first thinking you were going to say, like, and then you make a little hat and put it on.
Yeah, on the microphone. You put the little hat on the microphone and it can go from there. Actually, yeah, I think some of the Foley that they did on Star Wars was to that tune, wasn't it? It was like, I mean, those movies were made in like the 70s. I'm sure they had to do a lot of weird stuff for sound effects.
They have actually always done fascinating things for sound effects. I remember the tanks in episode 1 was a beard trimmer on the bottom of a metal pot.
Oh.
And they turned it on and went around in circles, and it made this weird, like, meow reverberation noise.
Yes.
And I remember watching a documentary about that, and I was like, so every time that scene comes on, I'm like, that's a beard trimmer. You know, I always get pumped.
Oh, man, give me more. I want one more tidbit at least. What do you got?
Yeah, I got one. The lightsabers are I believe, fluorescent tube, like the light bulb tube, and a shotgun mic, and you're waving the shotgun mic past the tube, so you pick up the hum of the fluorescent light as you're waving past it. And that's how you get that nice whop sound.
Wow, way safer than swinging the light bulb, I imagine, in front of the mic, you know?
That would be a disaster.
Isn't that happening like a Paul Rudd movie where Paul Rudd hits Steve Carell on the head with a fluorescent bulb? I think it does.
Sounds like something that would happen.
The idea of breaking fluorescent bulbs gives me trauma, so, you know.
Yeah, all the chemicals, the mercury and all that stuff in there. Ugh, no thanks. But yeah, I think it's really apt that we're talking about these DIY solutions that even, major Foley studios use. Just things like, coconuts for horseshoes. Like, they DIY a lot of stuff, and Vadim is one of the co-hosts of the DIY Recording Guys podcast. You've been running the podcast for just about a year, and this episode on the Band Hive podcast is going to be all about how you can make a good home demo to be prepared to go into the studio. But before we jump into that, Vadim, can you tell us, just for those who don't know the podcast, what your show is about?
Sure, yeah. So DIY Recording Guys is definitely aptly named. I'm somebody who basically have been recording out of whatever bedroom I have spare in the house for 15 or 16 years or so. And it took me probably close to a decade to get a recording that I didn't cringe at when I heard it back to back with a commercial release. And looking back on that, there's clearly a path that I could have taken that would have gotten me to a better result faster. And so I felt kind of very well positioned probably 5 or 6 years ago to speak on this subject and to try and help people to understand really the basics, like from the fundamental level about audio and recording technology and how to get better recordings. And so at that time, I got involved in a DIY recording meetup in Philadelphia, and I eventually ended up running the meetup. And we would just meet in various studios around Philly or even just at the library and talk about production. I would bring a laptop and a little interface. We would record a song and then do a mixing contest or just talk about little tips and tricks. And that was great. I did that for 4 or 5 years, but I realized that like my reach was kind of limited with that format. It was through meetup.com, and it was cool to meet people, but we kept getting new people on board and they kept wanting to start at the beginning. And so I found it hard to like build momentum and like build this community up in the way I wanted to. And right around that time, I met my co-host of the podcast, Benjamin Hull, and we thought like this would be a great podcast topic. It's an audio format, oftentimes without the visual distractions. And we thought, we can really do a long format that's not so much like top 10 tips for recording vocals, although we do that. We love tips, obviously. We all enjoy those kind of quick hit junk food type items. But we really wanted to kind of help people build a solid foundation through understanding some of these core concepts and then allow them to make better decisions on like, gear is being marketed towards you, or what do you really need? And having some of those core foundational things we thought would help people understand and make those decisions a little bit better. So yeah, we've been doing it for about a year. We're 64 episodes in, and it's going great.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think one of the things I like that you touched on there is that you don't just talk about the gear. You talk about the fundamentals. And that's what so many people miss in YouTube videos, tutorials, all that kind of stuff, because they look at the fun videos and nerd out about, oh, this piece of gear does this and that. It's like, okay, it does those things, but do you know how to properly use those features? Like, Vadim, is that a distressor I see behind you, I think?
Oh, it's, yeah, right. Do not look over here as I tell you that how much gear you don't need. It's a Fatso, Empirical Labs Fatso.
Okay. I noticed the EL Labs knobs then, I guess. EL Labs. I think the L is for Labs, James. Anyway, it's great to have gear like that if you can afford it, but it only helps if you actually know how to use it. So when you talk about the basics of compression on your podcast, that's huge because a lot of people looking at YouTube videos might not figure that out. They might look up how to compress a kick drum, and then they copy the settings, but they don't know what they're actually doing. So I think that's one of the key focuses of DIY Recording Guys is that you actually delve into the topics. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that in your little elevator pitch there.
Yeah, and I think, I listened to the episode you guys recently did on GAS, Gear Acquisition Syndrome. And I think Matt made a really good point there that I thought was a really nice punchline, which was something like, I don't remember it exactly, but something like make gear your hobby, like focus on the skills and then gear can be your hobby. And this is like a key thing for me is that I don't want to tell people like you don't need any gear and like you should just be a stoic because gear is fun. If you like recording and you're into this, then like gear is cool and it can be really fun. So I feel like online people swing wildly between you need to have this analog compressor to get the vocal sound you want versus like all you need is stock stuff in your DAW. And it's like, no, there's some middle ground here. We got to build a foundation of knowledge and then gear can be really fun.
Absolutely. I had a buddy who records up in Spokane, Washington, phenomenal producer, and he had Ryan Lewis and Macklemore swing by his studio. And so he asked him, he said, hey, can you show me a few tips and tricks? He wanted that same real quick, as you called it, that quick hit junk food high. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that. But he, said, oh yeah, this is what I'm doing. This is my setup. This is how I run things. And Ryan Lewis went through everything with him. He said, yeah, man, everything you've got is perfect. Now all you need is this microphone. And the microphone is like a $25,000 microphone. And I sat there thinking to myself, it's like, if your start to finish, if your ritual, if the habit, the way that you sit down and track and record, if that's beautiful and that's like done right from start to finish, and you're only, the only piece of the equation you're missing is a $25,000 microphone, it's like, okay, maybe I can take a step back and say, like, maybe you're a little bit too into the gear and it's a little bit more of a positive reinforcement. But no, I love that gear is important. I could sit there and nerd out on plugins all day. I remember when, what was it? Omnisphere. I remember when Omnisphere came out. And Omnisphere was like a writer's playground. You know, I'm sitting here, I'm like, holy cow. Like, I can, like, check it out. This is like beluga whales talking to each other. You know, which seems really cool. But in the grand scheme of things, like, do I really need 100,000 different samples? And, you know, and I loved that. But it definitely isn't this, you must have Omnisphere in order to make sure that your end product is perfect. And a lot of people, I think, they really miss that. You know, you're allowed to make a demo with low quality stuff. You're allowed to still have a little bit of vision in your head. You know, you're allowed to say, oh yeah, this crappy demo, this will get better. That's okay.
You're right, and you absolutely can't. You can make a great quality demo on very little stuff. What I found, because I have gone through phases. You guys mentioned this as well, like phases where I've been acquiring gear and selling gear, and what I've found is that pushing the gear you have to its furthest point, where I understand exactly how much I can get out of this guitar pedal, that then allows you to make your next gear decision. Whereas times when I've just bought a fancy thing and like, that's great, I don't really know how to use it, then I'm like, you know, I never understand how to drive my creative process from there. So I think there's a lot to be said for start with what you have and get the most out of it that you can. You will learn so much, and then you will understand its limitations and be able to kind of drive your future investments or purchases. Investments is a generous term.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think almost all audio engineers have started out where you buy all the gear you can afford and then figure it out. And then you're like, I don't need 3/4 of this. Like, that happens to a lot of people, I think. Maybe it doesn't happen to the ones who are true gear nerds and really have gas. If anyone wants to check out that episode that Vadim mentioned, by the way, it's number 62, Why Gear Isn't the Solution to All Your Problems. So you can find that at bandhive.rocks/62, or find that episode title in your favorite podcast app by going to better.band/listen and going to episode 62. Yeah, it's really difficult to see some artists get so frustrated with their home recordings, thinking that, oh, I just need a $4,000 mic. And it's like, no, you just need practice. And if you learn these things and study them and execute them, you will get better. Instead of perfecting one song over the course of a year, make a song every month. And that 12th song at the end of the year is going to be way better than the one song that you spent 12 months on would have been. So that's one of the reasons that we often advocate for artists not necessarily to do DIY home recordings, which, I mean, if that's all an artist can afford, by all means do that. But the main thing we advocate for is build your team around you and get a solid person to help with mixing and mastering. And before you ever set foot into a studio, have solid home demos. And I think that's one of the things that sets apart so many artists, because if you're going into the studio without demos, all of a sudden it's going to take you 2 or 3 times as long because you're figuring out parts. You're doing all these random things that you didn't prepare for your studio time, and now that's coming back to bite you. So that's why I think demos are important. Vadim, how about you? What makes a demo important to you?
Yeah, that's well said, James, and it's a great point. I think my conclusion, ultimately, maybe I'll talk about this in a bit, was the same as yours as far as like, where's the sweet spot here for artists? But before we even get to that, because it differs from artist to artist, I just want to point out that you basically have 3 resources for anything you want to do. You have money, you have time, and you have a network. So, which is to say, like, you can pay somebody to do something, you can invest a bunch of time and learn how to do it yourself or build it yourself, or you have your network, which is people you can lean on for advice or for services or whatever. So the stupid example I always use is, if I want a flute solo in my song, like, I could buy a flute and I could spend 10,000 hours trying to master the flute, and then I can record my solo. That's ludicrous. Nobody would ever do that. I can pay somebody $50 to record a flute solo, right? That's a no-brainer. So this is where you get into is like, how much time do you want to invest? How much money do you want to invest? This is going to differ a little bit from person to person. But I do think if you're an artist, your music is your resume, it's your product in a lot of cases. You want to have some control over it. And so I think there's a bare minimum threshold that every artist needs to cross with respect to recording knowledge. And I'll give you a couple of reasons. You asked, like, why is it important? Well, first of all, a basic understanding of multi-tracking is a very powerful songwriting tool. So if I'm sitting with a guitar, I can come up with a riff and maybe like the world's most out-of-tune vocal melody. Cool. If I have a looper pedal, maybe I can build on that. But if you can layer one part onto another part in GarageBand, onto another part, and then get a little bit of a beat going, I guarantee you, if you've never tried this, you will surprise yourself with the ideas you come up with. It's just a way to supercharge your writing process and share ideas with your bandmates. So that's one thing. Another thing is, do you guys listen to Tune Yards at all?
Nope. Can't say I've heard of them.
No? Okay. Wow. Okay. They're one of my favorite recording artists over the past decade. And Meryl Garbus is the vocalist, and she was saying how, for listeners, if you have listened to them, you know, it's great songwriting, but very unusual and unique production. And she was saying when she first started out, she was having a hard time working with engineers and producers because they weren't understanding her vision, or she wasn't able to communicate it, or she was able to communicate it, but they were telling her it's wrong, like you would never put a vocal there in a mix or whatever. So she had to kind of learn how to do these things herself. And her advice was to get something as close as you can to the sound that's in your head and then give it to somebody else for that remaining 10%. While I don't necessarily 100% agree with that approach, the basic principle is that it's your vision and you need to have some understanding of what you're doing in order to communicate that adequately, whether it's to your fans or to your producer or to your engineer or whatever. So, like, you know, recording and producing it's kind of like a language. Like if I'm describing coffee to you or something that tastes complex, I might say like it has hints of vanilla or blackberry or whatever. Like that's language. That's how we use language. If you're a musician and I tell you it's in A minor, I've told you a lot of information in a very short amount of time. Well, if I told you that this guitar sounds too mid-rangey or too warm or too honky, those are all words that describe a sound. And the more you can familiarize yourself with that language, the better and easier it will be for you to communicate your vision, which is great. And finally, I will say, like, you can save money doing DIY recording. Like, for one thing, James, you said if you've done your pre-production and you've really fleshed out your arrangements, you will spend less time in the studio. You will be more efficient. So you can absolutely save money with the DIY route as well.
I really love the point about doubling during writing, because I think that's something that so many artists, to me, I can always tell an amateur recording apart from a professional recording, not so much by the mix, which obviously there can be a very big difference in the mix, but at times I hear a great mix and there's just like single track guitar and I'm like, it's missing. This is absolutely amateur. They know how to make a decent mix, but it's amateur because there's only a left guitar and a right guitar. There's no doubling. You know, the lead comes in and the rhythm cuts out. Like, that is one of the easiest ways, at least for me, to tell the difference between a pro and an amateur. So I love that you brought that up.
Right. And so you have to have like gone through that, right? Like to get to that point, you have to have done it enough to know that like that doesn't sound quite right, right? So I assume that's how you came to that conclusion.
I was lucky that the first recording I ever did, we actually did double track rhythms and then put the leads over them. But that was because we had some very cool people helping out and like giving us feedback and stuff. And yeah, so that was the first recording I ever did. And it's still out there on the internet. I'm not going to tell people where to go listen to it.
Yeah, I never tell people where mine are either.
But it's still out there. So yeah, I love those points that you made about what makes a demo important, you know, aside from the money that obviously is a big pain point for a lot of people, is you don't have that much money to go into a studio, but just having the songwriting skills improved by it. That's really, really helpful, I think. So how would you differentiate between a good demo and a bad demo? What makes a demo stand out to you as having everything that a home demo should have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess there's some gray area here between what's a demo and what's a home recording that can then be the stems or the roots of the finished product. And they can be one and the same. But like, I'll give you an example. I'm actually working on a project right now in my studio with a guy who sent me just DI tracks. So just the DI of the guitars and the bass and some MIDI that he wanted. So that's point one, is he has clean, well-recorded tracks that you can do something with. Point two is he sent me a rough mix. So he sent me just, he reamped the tones, he did some stuff, and that gives me an idea of what he thinks is important. And then point 3 is he gave me a reference. He said, here's a commercial release that I really like the sound of. And so with those 3 components, I can then take that and do something with it, because I have good dry tones, and that's an important part of home recording, is taking the room out of the equation and trying to get good, clean, dry recordings. 2 is I have his demo, which tells me what he thinks is important. And then 3 is I have a commercial reference that kind of tells me some of the technical things that I need to know, like how loud should the snare drum be, and like, what's the general aesthetic and feel of the song. So I would say those are 3 components to really look for, and which is weird, right? Because like a reference track, you wouldn't necessarily think that's part of a good demo, but it can absolutely be part of a good demo for your production team of like, hey, I'm going for this Radiohead sound or whatever. Those are really important tools in your communication toolbox.
I think that's great, because those things are all things that I would have overlooked, which means probably most people would overlook them too.
Oh, give me yours.
To me, I would have focused much more on just the demo itself, like the rough mix essentially. And what I would have said would have been clearly defined arrangement would be the most important thing to me. Doesn't matter if it's played well, as long as I can tell what the idea is. Doesn't matter if the vocals are perfect or not, as long as I can tell where they're going. Just being able to hear the soul of the song and the direction it's going. But I think what you added about having those clean, dry tones there, especially for the engineer. If you're sending out a demo to people to completely re-record, maybe the clean, dry tones don't matter as much. But if you're sending it to a mix, absolutely, you need those clean tones, the DI tones, because otherwise it's just not going to end up sounding the way you expect it, because if you send an amp sim printed tone, it's not going to be what you expect in the end, unless you already have great tone. So that's basically my thoughts on what makes a good home demo recording.
Yeah, James, I completely agree with you there. I think from a standpoint of if you're just shopping around a demo or you're just trying to communicate the sound of your band, having that arrangement be clear and the focal points be the focal points is definitely important. Matt, I'm curious to know what your experience with Alive in Barcelona has been as well for demos. How do you guys approach that process?
Absolutely. Back in the day before we did demos, it was a giant topic of discussion for us. We had a guitarist who was phenomenal, but couldn't ever remember what he played. He would just write something absolutely incredible and he'd never be able to remember it. And so a lot of the time we would pull open Reaper or something like that, some free service that we could just get our ideas on paper, essentially. And once they were on paper, then we could kind of go back and revisit. And I remember it being a very interesting time in our musical career, because before that day, we literally had we'd never written music by, taking pieces and printing them and take this piece and print it. It felt a lot more modular, and we all kind of felt out of our element. My guitarist and I, we always referred to the bells and the whistles. And that's always what we would talk about when it came to recording. You can't forget the bells and the whistles, And, for those of you who are at a really small, early on level, there's one thing that you don't realize in your audio recordings, and it's you never realize what you don't have unless it's not there. And when you listen to this, like to a commercialized product, and you hear, it's just like, I always use The Pot by Tool as an example. If you turn that track up really, really loud, you can hear his vocals come in before his vocals come in. And there's like a reverse swell on it. And then eventually his vocals come in. And, most people will never even hear that. And for me, I imagine Maynard sitting there going, what do we do to make this better? This doesn't sound perfect enough yet. And meanwhile, probably 99% of the people that listen to that song will never even know that there's effects on there, that there's, there's phasing there. There's all sorts of production work that goes into literally that first half a second of a song. So for us, like sitting down with demos, it was really all about it wasn't even so much about format. Format was a big part of the song if we didn't already have something kind of set in stone. But really, it was about those bells and whistles. It was about those like, oh, I need this, single omnisphere tone to be playing in the background of my entire song. Then after working with high-level producers, when they would say things like, oh, yeah, like you can actually have that run over into the next song, and then you can really tie your songs together. It's like, oh, wow, we had never thought of this concept before. And so for us, it was just more about getting concrete ideas on paper that we could use as reference material. So that way, you can never get better if you don't have a historical recording of where you're coming from. And so for us, actually getting better because of the recordings, I mean, it was huge. The difference in our songwriting abilities exploded in leap years. We advanced leap years because we were able to go back and reference individual points of a song. We started off playing a little more hardcore music. And so there's a lot of really important accents and syncopation that all need to be super, super tight. And, there were times we would write a song, we'd go into the studio, and we realized that now the guitars aren't actually doing the same thing as the drums because we were playing it in a jam setting and everything is super loud. So for starters, getting a demo was night and day, literally the difference between trying to find something at nighttime and trying to find something at daytime. You had an exact reference point. I had a timestamp of when something goes wrong. You can say, hey, why is there a dead note on this? Hey, your strings start to sound like they needed to be changed halfway through this song. You actually have something that you can grow from. And that was like the first really big thing with demos. But I really, really love what you said about the idea behind your art and how you want your art to be portrayed, because I have also had the same song recorded by multiple different producers. And that's something that doesn't happen until a little bit later on in your career. And that was always really weird for me too, because we recorded our demo that sounded one way. We went to a producer who actually lied to us about his resume. And the product that we got from him had some really awesome things. It really did. And then we ended up getting it re-recorded again. And that second professional recording had a totally different sound, but was still our song and still sounded totally awesome, but in a completely different way. And then a third and final time for the full-length album, we recorded it again with a different producer, and it yet again had a different sound. Again, we liked it, but somewhere in between those three, like we never sat down as a band and said, oh man, it's really important for us to have these soaring guitar leads. Like it's really important for us to make sure that the breakdowns hit super heavy. Like that was something that we never actually like really sat down with. I think in our minds, we chose a producer that, it's like, oh, this guy did I the Breather. Like the breakdowns sound awesome. So therefore our breakdowns are going to sound awesome. So I really like what you said about art. And it's important for, anyone who's listening to remember that your art is the representation of who you are as an individual. And the person who is going to make sure that that art is perfect or that it sounds the way that it should be is you, the artist. That, like you were saying, that artist who she had producers telling her that what she was doing was just wrong. But people used to tell Jimi Hendrix that he was playing guitar wrong.
Upside down, for one thing.
The thing is, there's no such thing as wrong art. There's a reason that there's a phrase, it's an art, not a science. And that's because art is expressive and art is beautiful. As long as you're not just throwing out carbon copy garbage, then your expression needs to be like at the forefront of what you're doing. And so for us, demos helped us learn what it was, what we needed out of music production. And that sounds like drastic and, epic, but it really was. We were not writing music on the caliber that we needed to in order to live a life of musicians. We couldn't have done it with our old band. Our songs were too long. Our parts were too long. They weren't dynamic enough. So yeah, no, for us as a band, demos brought us to the next level. They forced us to compete at the next level. And it was really because it forced us to sit down and listen to each individual note. If one of us was playing something that didn't feel right, we could isolate that. We could identify it. We could troubleshoot it. Kind of like if you're having random mic problems or a USB port goes out. You can troubleshoot it if you have enough minds collectively working together and identifying the problem. And with a demo, when you have a hard copy, it also just makes things a lot better too, because you have a hard copy you can send to people. But yeah, the best thing about demos for me as an artist specifically was actually having a point of reference that we could come back to and say, this needs to change, this part needs to be rewritten, this part needs to be recorded.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt.
Yeah. Vadim, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, how you would work with an artist to restructure the demos that they send to you, to rework it and flesh out their arrangement or find a better way for them to express their feelings through the song.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I think one thing Matt spiked out there was this idea of pre-production. It's when you're sitting in a room together as a band and you're all playing and it's loud and everybody just feels amazing, right? That's great. And that definitely it can be the genesis of a lot of wonderful ideas. But once you get those down into multi-tracks and you really put the microscope on things, you might find, and this happens all the time when I work with bands, it's like, wait, why is the kick drum doing that? And then the bass guitar is doing something different. And you're like, this would be a lot more powerful if the kick came in on the one, like, trust me. So you can dig into some of those details once you have the multi-track session and rework some of those things just by virtue of having a microscope on them and being able to mute and solo things and being able to focus. Like Matt said, you have a timestamp, being able to go back and listen to something catches you for a second. You don't just keep playing through it. You go back and listen again. You're like, okay, stuff starts to come to the surface. So that's one thing. And the other thing that you guys kind of touched on, which I also think is very valid, is this idea of pushing a creative idea as far as you can push it and then letting somebody else put their ear on it and push it even further. And this happens all the time. Like, I started out as a songwriter recording my own songs, and it's exhausting to do everything yourself. And so you guys are, Matt, you were mentioning the bells and whistles, right? So like, okay, I put in 2 bells and 1 whistle and like, I'm a sponge and I've been wrung out now. Creatively, I'm just drained. Now I give that, what I've done, to somebody else and they add a couple more bells and whistles. And, there's a reason why a lot of these commercial tracks that we all know have like 7 or 8 people on the credits. It's because it takes that many ideas and different perspectives and different approaches to add the right amount of bells and whistles. And actually, my podcast co-host, Ben, also has a studio, and because we're friends and we work together and we've learned to trust each other's ears, we will often send stuff to each other for mastering. And it's amazing because it's not like he's better or I'm better. 9 times out of 10, what one of us sends to the other one comes back better because you get that slightly different perspective and that slightly different adjustment. So you can really get more out of your song by having a demo, taking it as far as you can, and then kind of letting other people put their spin and touch on it.
Fresh ears, they're absolutely integral.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a huge point too. Like, if an artist records a demo, they can send it to a friend who's, in the know, like a friend who's also in a band, who's a good writer or is a good arranger, and have that friend give them feedback before they send it off to their producer or engineer to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. So they'll already have those small improvements that other people in their circle can recommend. I'm learning so much more about why demos are useful, and the topic of demos being useful is something we've been pushing for quite a while. So I'm so glad you're here chatting about this, Vadim. This is great. For artists who want to do a demo but have no idea where to start, what would you suggest there? What's the first step?
Yeah. So, the wonderful thing about the time we live in is that it's never been more accessible for artists to make good sounding demos at home than it is today. And that's for a number of reasons, both the availability of resources and the availability and affordability of technology. But we'll start with saying that you need a computer. And if you have a computer that you've bought within the last, 5 to 7 years, it'll probably be good enough to get you started. Some of these programs that we're going to talk about maybe take a little bit more RAM, but if you have like 4 gigabytes of RAM, that's the bare minimum, I would say. 8 is better, but you'll be okay with a computer that you bought within the last 5 to 7 years. The next thing you'll need is an interface. And what an interface is, I like to describe it as like the grand central station of your recording rig, which is to say that, like all the trains that come in and out of New York City have to go through Grand Central Station. all the audio that comes into and out of your computer has to go through an interface. So the interface is a box. It's a way to package a couple of components together. One is it has preamps. So preamps are what allow you to take a weak signal, like something off of an electric guitar or off of a microphone, and boost it a little bit so that it's loud enough to then do something with. And in this case, what we're doing with it is we're converting it to a digital signal, to ones and zeros, because that's the language that our computer speaks. So the interface packages these couple of things together. You can plug in a microphone and you can get a digital signal coming out into your computer. And the important thing to consider with an interface is how many channels you need or how many preamps you need. Like the most affordable ones will usually have 2 inputs, 2 outputs. Some now even have 1 input. I would say try to go for something with at least 2 inputs so you can record stereo sources if you need to. But remember, we're talking about multi-track recording, so you can use those 2 inputs to layer as many things as you want on top of each other. So you got your computer, you'll need an interface. The next thing you'll need is your instruments, which you hopefully already have, and something like a microphone to capture acoustic sources. It's funny because we were talking about mic stands. If you guys want to touch on that. But mic stands is something I've learned not to be stingy on, because a microphone is usually one of your most prized investments in the studio. And the mic stand is the only thing standing between that microphone and a 6-foot drop to the ground. So invest in a nice mic stand. Once you have those things, your cables, obviously, you'll need, I would say, 2 more things. One is the software that we're going to record into, which is called a digital audio workstation, or DAW. There's a lot of free ones out there, or trial versions or student versions. Like GarageBand is a great one to start working with. And then there's some other, the higher tier ones you probably heard of are like Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase. So you'll need some kind of program. They're all pretty much the same functionally. Just pick one that you think you'll be comfortable with and try to learn it. And then finally, I'll say if you're recording acoustic sources, you should have some way of killing the room noise. And this is where we get into like language of recording technology. What do I mean when I say kill the room? Well, it means to minimize the amount of room sound that's getting into your microphones. There's great DIY ways to do this. You can record vocals in a closet where you have a bunch of clothes hanging. You can use mic stands. I do this all the time. You make a mic stand into a T and throw blankets over the top of it. Put pillows from the couch kind of on your reflection points. So that's like bare sections of wall where sound will reflect off of your mouth or your instrument and reach the microphone. So removing the room is kind of like the last bit I would say you need there to start making quality demos at home. I'm going to do a shameless pitch if you guys let me.
Please do.
We have a free DIY recording ebook. If you're completely new to this, I promise if you know how to use a computer, this will make the process more accessible to you. If you go to howtorecordyourband.com, you can download that PDF there.
All right. Nice, easy domain right there. Howtorecordyourband.com. I dig it.
I know. I couldn't believe that was available, so I snagged that quickly.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, so that covers the gear that artists need to record demos, and that kind of stuff. It does add up in cost pretty quickly, but if it saves, several $1,000s of studio time, that's going to pay for itself the first time you go into the studio, or if not the first time, at least by the second time. So for the artists who have all the gear, but just have no idea what to do, let's say they're a rock band, and obviously they have a stereo interface, so they can't mic up a full drum kit. What would the step-by-step process, once they have a song that they want to do a demo for, how would they go about doing that? Just 30,000-foot view, what's the step-by-step you would suggest?
Sure. Well, once you have your basic gear and you kind of roughly understand how to set your DAW up with your interface so you can arm tracks for recording, you can record your 2 tracks, you kind of have to plan your recording strategy a little bit. A great thing to do is to make, I forget what it's called. Cue sheets? Not cue sheets, but what's matrix, where you have each part and each part of the song.
I know, like the grid, but I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, the grid.
We'll just call it storyboarding.
That works.
Yeah, it's like storyboarding, but so you basically outline, picture a grid, okay? And each row in the grid is like an instrument, right? So bass, kick, whatever you have, guitar, vocals. And then each column is like the song section. So like intro, verse 1, chorus, whatever. And you just want to keep track roughly of what your song looks like. It's like a map of your song. And this is going to be important because I can't tell you how many times I've finished the session, rolled up all my mic cables, put everything away, and I'm like, oh my God, there was supposed to be an acoustic guitar in the intro.
Oh,
Now we didn't get it. Now what do we do? Right? So keep organized. Understand going into the day, like what you want to record, especially if you have multiple people, it'll help you schedule things out. Then from, a tracking strategy, you want to decide if you're going to use a click track. I usually like to err on the side of a click track depending on the genre, but typically you can get better, tighter takes with less editing if you are recording to a click. Of course, if you're playing, free-form jazz, then that's not going to work for you. That's cool. But it's common to start tracking drums first. So you can absolutely record a drum kit with a stereo interface. You can just use 2 overhead mics and record that kit, and then you'll be able to do amazing things. An engineer can do amazing things with just a pair of overheads recording a drum kit. So start with the drum kit. If the drummer has good rhythm, that should serve you well. And then record other instruments up from there. I usually like to actually recommend people do guitars before bass because it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's important, I think, for the bass player to hear the nuances of the guitarist. Not that bass players are less important, but you can typically get a tighter sound that way. And then usually you save vocals for last once everything is done. Do your vocals, and I mean, is that high level enough? You guys, I can talk about this for days, James. So tell me where you want to go.
no, I think that's great because a lot of artists might just go and say, okay, well, I'm going to do the vocals. And then when they try to go back and do the drums and the bass, they have trouble fitting it in there. So that's exactly what I was going for, is just the do this, and this. I also like doing guitars before bass. I don't always do it before bass. I'll see what the band is more comfortable with. But years ago, a band turned me onto that because they said, oh, well, I want to do my bass parts after the guitar. I'm like, okay, that's not how I usually do it, but we can make it work. And it turned out really well. So that's definitely something that a lot of engineers don't do, but I think more engineers should at least be open to.
It's super counterintuitive, but it's just one note on there. Like, one of the reasons I think that's true is because it's harder for us to perceive notes on a bass guitar. Like, the low frequencies are a little bit tricky to perceive. So like, if a bass player is doing some little nuanced trill thing that's half steps apart, it might be hard for the guitarist to hear that and follow it, but it'll sound off. It'll sound a little out of tune. So I think that's one big reason why. Sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, you're wonderful. That actually plays in very nicely to what I was about to say. And that one huge trick to all the bassists out there, don't get upset about this. But your rhythm guitarist should record your bass. Whoever is tracking your rhythm parts on guitar should also be tracking your rhythm on bass. And that was something that we learned a long time ago. And like you were saying, I started off as a bassist. So this hurts my heart to even have to say. But when you have somebody that's writing a rhythm section and they are staying really, like even if you don't have super complex rhythms, just the natural tightness. I mean, even if a guitarist gets up there, records his rhythm parts, and then immediately switches over to bass and tracks those, he's going to be well practiced. He has the rhythms.
Muscle memory.
Exactly. Imprinted literally in his fingertips. And so while going to the studio sometimes can be a little bit upsetting for bassists, you have to remember that the end goal is your product sounding crisp, clean, and tight. And I have literally had a guitarist have to redo all of the bassist's parts before on recordings. And, and it was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary for the end product to be what it was supposed to be.
Oh, that is rough. So the question that comes up for me there is, what about if the guitarist is not necessarily as good of a bass player as the bass player and can't play the bass parts as they've been written?
So in that case, let's take the Red Hot Chili Peppers, for example. Your guitarists are playing totally entirely different things, and their style is really, really emulated in their playing. And so I think things like that are like if you have a bassist that is the literal backbone of your band, then let the dude shine. Yeah. That's one of the two highs in the music industry. Like we always say aces in their places. You know who the aces are. My first band ever, our guitarist, he was a gearhead. We'll bring this around full circle. He was a gearhead. He was one of those people that he could sit there and, turn his pickups on and play his pedals like a keyboard and get just crazy. I mean, he knew what they did. And then by the time that he and I had basically finished playing together, he was a purist where he was like, oh, my goal is to take this Strat, plug it into that, Roland jazz chorus with this 1/4 inch and get the most beautiful, perfect sound out of it. So for him, he kind of had this, like he went from one way all the way to the other. But nobody ever would have been the person that says like, oh, Josh, you shouldn't play the guitar. It's like, yeah, right. I literally watched him play Eruption upside down on a right-handed guitar. He's a lefty. When he was 15, there was never, ever, it didn't matter how good of a bassist I ever became. I was never going to be the person who would track bass if it came down to it. And that's that's kind of a humility thing. If like, I'm not the best drummer in my band, so why would I sit at the drum kit? I wouldn't. If I'm not the best bassist in the band, if I'm not the best rhythm player, and then sometimes you have to take a step back because you're sitting there saying, oh, I'm paying thousands of dollars. Like I deserve to have my, my voice heard on this album. And they do, and so that kind of ties right in with what we talk about being practiced and well rehearsed. If you guys play super tight and you're warm, then great. Let the bassist do it. You shouldn't walk into a studio and say, well, our guitarist is just going to track all the rhythm and that's how it's going to be. But, if he sits down, he starts playing and your producer just kind of gives you this look like, hey man, we're going to be spending an extra day tracking these parts that you literally just tracked and could probably knock out in 30 minutes, and at what point do you have to say monetary and time investment, your feelings? Like it's a very, very hard thing to weigh because these are people you care about. They're your bandmates, they're your family, and you don't want to hurt them, which is why you as an individual need to have personal accountability. You need to be well practiced, well rehearsed. And when people come into, when it's time to work, like you need to be practiced and ready to go. If you're not, well, then you're going to sacrifice some of those highs. And on top of that, you're going to be sacrificing everybody's highs because the producer's going to be sitting there going like this, like, ugh, are we done with this yet? And that's the last thing you want. You don't ever want a producer who's bored of your music. Every producer I've ever worked with loves tracking my drummer. He's classically trained. He marched drum corps for years. He literally spent summers playing for 12 hours in a hot field with a click playing over the PA speakers. So just literally 10 hours a day playing to a click, getting sunburnt. And whenever he tracks his drum parts, it's like I asked the producer, I'm like, oh, what's the fastest you've ever had a drummer track stuff? And most of them are like, about that fast. And he's well rehearsed. He's well practiced, so keep your aces in their places, set emotions aside. Let the emotions come up when you're selling your album, That's when the emotions should be ripe. That's when you should be like, oh, yes, like here's my record. Do I care that some of my bandmates have sang some harmonies on our album? Of course not. Some of them have a better tonality for certain harmony parts. That's not going to upset me if I'm not singing all of the vocals on my album. In my opinion, that seems really childish and immature. So for me, it's like, no, dude, let's get as many of the greatest things that we can do as a collective. Let's print that to an album. And if that means that like I have to play a bass part, then that's what has to happen. If that means that you have to sing, then that's fine. Then let's do that. Let's make the adult decision. You should never be so emotionally attached to your business that you cannot make a hard decision about your business. And so like write music that you like, but don't limit your product because it's going to emotionally hurt you. That's like the cardinal mistake in my opinion.
Man, knowledge bombs left and right.
I like talking with Vadim. He's easy to talk to.
Agreed. Well, Vadim, as we pivot to wrap things up, is there any one of the knowledge bombs that you've shared today that you want to highlight as like the most important piece of information you could give to an artist who wants to start recording their home demos?
Oh man, I gotta boil it all down into a soundbite, huh? Well, I think, again, I will highlight those three resources, right? Time, money, and your network. And I like, especially building on what Matt said there a lot, is the thing I love about recorded music. The live show is beautiful in and of itself, but with a recorded piece, you really have the ability to fine-tune every little thing that gets onto that recording. So you want it to be the best it can be, and that means doing what Matt said, which is putting aside your ego and letting the art kind of drive what is necessary. And I would encourage everybody to take a step back and think about how that ties into these three resources and what they want to invest time in. I think a lot of the time people are hesitant to record. I would encourage them to step back and investigate the source of that hesitancy. Is it because you're intimidated by the technology and because the YouTube videos you see are over your head and you don't understand what's going on? If so, I promise you, if you know how to use a computer, you can record demos at home. DIY Recording Guys podcast is a great place to start if you're interested in learning more about that. But if your hesitancy is that you feel like an emotional drain when you think about recording, you're just not interested in it. I know musicians like that. They're fantastic musicians and songwriters. They just don't care about recording. Then maybe your balance of those three resources changes a little bit. And now you're more into leveraging your network and paying people to get what you want, more so than trying to force DIY. DIY isn't for everyone. So I guess that would be my final, it's a long-winded way of saying it, but I would say search your feelings. There it is. The May the 4th tie-in. Yes. I knew it was there. So search your feelings, understand what's been holding you up from recording demos at home, and then try to figure out how you're going to balance your three resources to get past that.
Man, I think that is a perfect way to wrap things up. That's what all business comes down to. Recognizing that it applies to demos. Oh, that's perfect, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You already shouted out howtorecordyourBand.com, the free ebook. Are there any other resources aside from the DIY Recording Guys podcast, which is, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the major apps? Anything you want to share with the audience?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love what you guys are doing for artists. I think it's such an important thing, and recognizing that people who are in the Bandhive community, are serious about their craft and serious about making their bands work. We wanted to offer something special. So if you go to, it's a long link, but resources.diyrecordingguys.com/Bandhive, we have a quick demo recording checklist for you there. And just keep doing what you're doing. I think it's really a wonderful resource for the DIY band community, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Vadim. That means the world to us.
Yeah, we really appreciate the kind words as well as you coming on the show. Thanks for taking the time out of your morning.
Thanks for having me.
May the 4th be with you.
Yes. May the 4th be with you. That does it for this episode of the Bandhive podcast. Thanks so much to you for tuning in. And of course, big thanks again to Vadim from DIY Recording Guys for coming on the show to share his thoughts on demoing your songs. We really hope that you learned a lot from Vadim. And just as a reminder, you can check out the DIY Recording Guys podcast in your favorite podcast app. Pretty much wherever you listen to the Bandhive podcast should also have DIY Recording Guys. So go check that out because it is a great podcast. I listen to it myself and I find it quite enjoyable. That being said, we do have a Facebook community that we would love for you to join. You can find it by searching for Bandhive on Facebook, or you can just go to bandhive.rocks/group to automatically be redirected. In that community, you will find lots of like-minded artists who are ready and willing to take their business seriously. So if you have questions, ideas, anything you want to share or learn, please head on over to that group and use the resources available to you, because I think it will be incredibly helpful for you. We'll be back next week with another new episode, Tuesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, have a great week, stay safe, and of course, as always, keep rocking.